Hello everyone and welcome to my The Bold and Beautiful Always channel. Taylor and Steffy depart Los Angeles right away to confirm that Thomas died in Paris. The call was a blank rather than a scream. A gaping hole in the center of the painstakingly restored world of Steffy Forrester Finnegan. Outside her exquisite apartment overlooking the Seine, the city was still quiet and the sky was just stained by the Parisian dawn. Before becoming a seismic shock, the phone's vibration was an intrusion. Thomas's little boy, Douglas Forrester, carried the information through a nanny, his voice faint and broken with tears. "Papa, there was an accident in the atelier, the hospital called, they said, he's gone." The words didn't make sense. Lost. Similar to Steffy's own well-planned European getaway, but more definitive. Absolutely. Was her brother, Thomas, her erratic, intelligent, and incessantly complex other half, permanently quiet in the city where she had sought her own privacy? The elaborate chamber swayed. Downstairs, the aroma of freshly baked croissants became overpowering and sickening. Her hand went to her mouth to quell a wave of choking incredulity rather than to suppress a scream. Thomas was unable to go. Not after everything. Not after overcoming his own darkness, Hope's rejection, and starting again in Paris with Douglas. It must have been an error. A cosmic, horrible mistake. At the same time, daybreak threatened 3,000 miles away in Los Angeles. The Florentine nightmare was still a raw, festering wound as Taylor Hayes sat by herself in her therapist's office, not as a practitioner but as a patient. The delicate serenity she had been attempting to create was broken by the harsh ring of the phone. "Taylor, it's Thomas. In Paris. There's been an accident. They say he didn't make it." Ridge's voice, shorn of its normal command, raw and broken, gave the same impossible news. The world didn't tilt, it dissolved. Her son. Her eldest child. The child whose hardships had paralleled her own, whose salvation she had battled for with all her strength. She was struck by the image of his optimistic expression when he had departed for Paris with the intention of starting a new life for himself and Douglas. Lost. Ridge's voice left a void in which the word reverberated. The meticulously rebuilt barriers of her mind, which had already been shattered by the realization of Ridge's heinousness, completely collapsed. She let forth a primordial, unidentifiable keening cry. She was buried beneath tons of freezing, stifling sorrow by grief, which was an avalanche rather than a wave. A spark, however, flared beneath the crushing weight, the same strong, protecting instinct that had characterized her parenthood. Check. The word throbbed like a fading flame. Ridge's ability to fabricate lies and plan evil overflowed her thoughts. Is this one more? A cruel trick? A front for something more sinister? The idea was terrible, but the doubt that had been sown in Florence grew in the rich soil of new suffering. Within hours, Taylor and Steffy were racing across the Atlantic towards one another, driven by a terrifying undercurrent of mistrust and a shared, desperate denial. It was a gravitational pull, and no cooperation was required. They met at the sterile, harsh entrance of the Hopo-European Georges Pompidou, not at Charles de Gaulle. There was no embrace at the reunion. Steffy appeared like a marble statue crumbling, her face pallid behind skillfully applied makeup that was unable to conceal the effects of shock. Taylor's normally calm demeanor was replaced with a terrible stillness, and her eyes were gloomy and haunted. Their eyes met, mother and daughter, bound together not by affection but by a same, dreadful purpose, to face the empty space, to demand evidence, to discover the meaning behind the two words that rocked their world: Thomas Forrester, dead. Fluorescent lights and the sterile stench of institutionalized misery filled the hospital hallways. Monsieur Dubois, a solemn administrator, greeted them with a kind professional look. He verified the essential details. Thomas Forrester was admitted late the night before after a disastrous accident in his private design studio on the affluent Rue Cambon. Extreme trauma. Failed attempt at resuscitation. Declared deceased at 3:17 a.m. He provided documents and condolences. When it did come, Steffy's voice sounded like stones scraping flint. Du Bois hesitated, citing protocol and the requirement for identification by next of kin, but the dreadful emptiness in Taylor's eyes and the raw, dangerous intensity in Steffy's brooked no argument. "We need to see him. Now." The viewing room at the mortuary was a chilly, silent chapel. In the middle was the gurney, a sheet covering a still body. The smell of disinfection and something deeper and more definitive lingered heavy in the air. Taylor's hand shook uncontrollably as she reached out, and her breath caught. Beside her, Steffy stood stiff, her jaw so tightened that a muscle popped in her cheek. The attendant pulled the sheet back slowly. Thomas was the one. However, it wasn't. The damage to the face was horrifying. Deeply bruised, swollen, and lacerated, especially around the cheekbone and left temple. One eye was half open, but glassy and empty, the other swelled shut. Dried blood matted his renowned dark hair. The curve of his mouth, the line of his jaw, and his unquestionable bone structure were all made monstrous by violence. Taylor's knees buckled as she let out a strangled moan. Steffy's body shook as she caught her. It was a harsh, visceral confirmation. But Steffy's meticulously trained designer eye caught it. The wounds appeared to be targeted. The left side was brutally hit, while the right side was comparatively spared. It appeared to be more of a targeted blow than a chaotic accident. Despite her emotions, Taylor forced herself to see the world as a psychologist who had witnessed the aftermath of violence rather than as a distraught mother. The bruise pattern wasn't exactly consistent with a straightforward fall. It suggested something more purposeful. Steffy told Du Bois bluntly, "We need to see the atelier," in an unconveyed tone. Now. Where it happened. Camden Road. The top story of a historic building housed Thomas's atelier, which he had meticulously transformed into a combination design workshop, showroom, and private haven. The entrance had crisscrossed police tape. The moniker Forrester, along with Steffy's cold authority and Taylor's eerie presence, allowed them reluctant access, despite the board flick standing watch. It was a moment of turmoil captured on film. Mannequins that had been overturned were lying like fallen soldiers. The floor was covered in bolts of beautiful fabric, some of which were darkly crimson in color and others of which were rich velvets and delicate silks. Dispersed, ripped, and crumpled drawings showed daring, cutting-edge designs. On its side was a bulky, industrial sewing machine. And the focal point, a huge, elaborate antique mirror, its once gleaming surface now a labyrinth of fissures extending from a vicious impact point in the middle. Glass fragments were scattered on the floor underneath it, gleaming among the bloodstains like cancerous diamonds. According to the police report, which the flick succinctly summarized, Thomas was working late, possibly feeling lightheaded or startled, when he lost his balance and struck his head violently against the edge of the mirror before falling. Taylor stood amid the debris, looking around the room. Although her grief was a living thing, her analytical mind, which had been refined over decades of analyzing tragedy and human behavior, went into overdrive. There were smaller, fainter drops of blood that trailed several feet away, towards a huge, draped work table, but the majority of the blood spatter was focused close to the mirror. A battle? A startling ascent? Some of the overturned mannequins appeared to have been thrown rather than just fallen. The bulky sewing machine was in the way of a side door. Intentional? Steffy wandered in silence, studying the frame of the mirror. Not only were there deep gouges from impact, but were there also scratches in the old wood? Similar to fingernails? Her fingers brushed a bloodstain as she knelt. She noticed a gleam. One large silver cufflink, partially hidden by a strip of midnight blue silk, was etched with a complex V that was clearly not Thomas's style. "Man," Steffy held it up and whispered. Dawning fear strained her voice. "This isn't his." Taylor's heart froze. The cufflink. The uneven splatter of blood. The targeted head damage. The door that was blocked. Given Ridge's reputation for violence, his contacts, and the fact that he had been in Europe only a few weeks prior, was Florence an isolated incident? Had Thomas made a discovery? Faced him? The apprehension she had harbored regarding Ridge turned into a dreadful certainty. This was no coincidence. It was murder. And was that really Thomas's body in the mortuary? Identification was challenging because to the damage. What if it was a ruse? A disguise? Desperate sadness and growing paranoia gave rise to the crazy idea, but it took hold. Their grief-stricken inquiry turned into a last-ditch, covert search into Paris's underbelly. They disregarded the official police since they didn't trust their findings. Steffy made advantage of her powerful Forrester Creations resources and Parisian contacts, enlisting the help of covert security companies, fashion insiders, and even a former model with connections to dubious information brokers. Drawing from a reservoir of fortitude she was unaware she had left, Taylor applied her psychology background to examine the images of the crime scene they had illegally taken. Like ghosts, she returned to the atelier at night to look for anything the police might have overlooked. They followed the cufflink, a little-known style from a posh Vienna boutique. The trail led them to a secret private clinic on the outskirts of Paris that specialized in neurological recovery and, rumor had it, discreet long-term care for patients requiring anonymity. They learned that the man who fit Ridge's description had purchased it, through hushed questions and blurred CCTV footage obtained by a hacker Steffy paid handsomely, just days before Thomas's accident. They got in by pretending to be worried family members looking for second opinions on traumatic brain injuries. The director couldn't turn down Steffy's generous donation despite his skepticism. He guided them through silent hallways that smelled of antiseptic and silent hopelessness. Then they saw him in a private room lit by the gentle glow of a monitoring gadget. Thomas. Alive. Not Thomas, though. He lay horribly motionless in a hospital bed, hooked up to blinking, buzzing machinery. Although still damaged, his face was recovering and his recognizable features could be seen beneath the receding trauma. The left side of his skull, where the catastrophic hit had happened, was bandaged. He had his eyes shut. He was breathing, but it was a deep coma beat, shallow and mechanical. With a sob choking in her throat, Taylor's hand shot to her mouth. With her knuckles white and tears finally streaming down her cheeks, Steffy clutched the doorframe. Alive. The word served as a lifeline, a condemnation, and a prayer. The physical intensity of the relief nearly knocked them to their knees. However, the scene was also heartbreaking. This mute, shattered vessel was all that remained of the dynamic, passionate, disturbed force that was Thomas Forrester. Found barely breathing at the scene, initially declared dead due to the severity of the trauma and lack of vital signs upon first EMS arrival, the director explained in hushed tones. Hurried to Poppy Doo, where a weak pulse was miraculously revived by urgent efforts in the emergency room. Severe brain damage caused by trauma. Diffuse shearing of the axons. Profound coma. The prognosis is extremely dubious. A terrible administrative mistake during the confusion of his entrance was the misinterpretation of his death. Later, his identification was verified by fingerprints, but by then, Douglas's nanny, who was his emergency contact, had received the false notification. Just hours after his stabilization, an unidentified benefactor used intricate legal procedures to arrange and pay for the clinic's confidentiality and skill. Anonymous? Steffy asked in a harsh voice. Who? The director's hands were extended wide. A legal firm. Shell corporations. The money is untraceable. They insisted on absolute secrecy, even from family, citing security concerns. Taylor took a step towards the bed. She disregarded the tubes and the machines. She trembled and touched Thomas's hand gently. The temperature was warm. Alive. Unchecked, the tears poured down her cheeks. Her lips brushed his unbruised forehead as she bent down. "Thomas," she said in a broken voice. "Oh, my boy, we're here." Behind her, Steffy's thoughts were racing. The cufflink. The existence of Ridge. The fictitious mishap. The payments were anonymous. The confidentiality was enforced. It was an attempt at erasure, not only an attack. They were left to mourn a phantom when someone attempted to have Thomas Forrester vanish and bury him alive behind layers of money and lies, and the evidence horribly pointed to Ridge. There was a chilly rage that clashed with the relief of discovering him breathing. In the midst of the bureaucratic confusion, the man in the mortuary had been a decoy, a victim of circumstance exploited to sell the lie. Although Thomas's survival was miraculous, his future was uncertain and frightening. And who did it? It's still out there. Still strong. Still able. They stayed in Paris. In the clinic, they set up vigil. While holding Thomas's hand, Taylor sang old lullabies, whispered memories, and poured all of her broken hope into the quiet between them. By arranging for dependable neurologists to be flown in from Switzerland, employing discreet, elite security to watch over the chamber, and beginning her own covert, brutal probe, Steffy turned into a fortress. The investigation into death had turned into a struggle for his life and a search for the man responsible for his silence. Their broken brother and son, a living ghost in a sterile chamber, and the dark, glittering shadow of the man who may have attempted to put him out were all now in the City of Light. The truth they were looking for was a beginning rather than an end. It was a maze of treachery and shaky hope that was darker than any catacomb in Paris. Even if Thomas was still alive, the battle for his future and the atonement for the transgressions he committed in the shadow of Rue Cambon had only just begun. The world's loudest sound was the quiet of his coma, which screamed questions that could only be answered by retribution or redemption. Nick and Taylor share a bond despite their heartbreaks. At Il Giardino on a quiet afternoon when the sun hung low and cast warm amber hues across the empty terrace, Taylor Hayes found herself seated at a far corner table with a glass of red wine she'd barely sipped, her eyes wandering across the patio with a wistful heaviness, the kind born from years of heartbreak and emotional war zones that left invisible scars, and just when she thought the silence might consume her, Nick Marone appeared, weathered and contemplative, his hands in the pockets of his leather jacket, eyes meeting hers with a mixture of surprise and knowing pain, as though the universe had placed them both here at the right time, not by accident but by some cruel, poetic symmetry, and with a simple, awkward smile and a tilt of his head, he asked if he could join her, and Taylor nodded, not out of politeness, but because her heart recognized a fellow survivor. They sat together without saying a word for the first few moments, the kind of silence that isn't empty but full of mutual understanding, and finally Nick let out a breathy chuckle, rubbing the back of his neck as he muttered, "You ever just feel like you've lost the script, like everyone else is playing the same scene on repeat, and you're just, backstage, forgotten?" And Taylor's laugh came unexpectedly, soft but real, nodding as she replied, "Every day," and with that, the invisible wall between them dissolved, and their conversation flowed like a gentle tide, the pain of their recent heartbreaks, Taylor's humiliation and devastation from Ridge's latest betrayal, his renewed proposal to Brooke after saving her from drowning, and Nick's quiet suffering after yet another failed attempt at love that fizzled before it even caught fire, fusing into a shared story of being discarded, overlooked, used as emotional stepping stones for other people's fantasy endings. Taylor admitted how foolish she felt for once again believing Ridge would choose her, how she thought maybe this time, after everything, he'd see her, really see her, not just the psychiatrist, not the doting mother of his children, but the woman who stood beside him through chaos, loss, and growth. And Nick, swirling the wine in his glass, told her about his latest flame, a corporate consultant who said all the right things until the moment she found out he still carried a photo of Jack in his wallet, still called Brooke's name in his sleep, and walked away without even saying goodbye. The wounds they shared weren't identical, but they mirrored each other in depth and ache, and soon, Taylor reached across the table without even realizing it, resting her hand on Nick's, and he didn't pull away. He welcomed the connection, the human touch that wasn't transactional or layered with manipulation, just two hearts stitched together with honesty and pain. They reminisced about the old days, the sailing trips, the stormy nights, the times when life felt infinite, and they believed in second chances without the cynicism that time inevitably brings. Nick reminded her of the time they'd almost escaped to Paris, talked about running away from the madness of Richburg-Taylor Triangle, and Taylor smiled through misty eyes, admitting that sometimes she wonders what would have happened if they had just gone, just dared to be selfish for once. Nick leaned back, arms folded, looking at her with a quiet reverence, saying, "You know, you were the only one who ever really asked how I felt about losing Jack," and Taylor blinked, because even though years had passed, she still remembered that day vividly. How broken he'd been, how abandoned, how he wasn't just mourning the child he raised but the illusion of family, and Taylor had sat with him, listened, held his hand, never judging, only giving, and now, in this strange full-circle moment, they were doing it all again. As the sun dipped lower and shadows crept across the patio floor, they realized they didn't want to leave, not because this was romance rekindled or some grand love story reawakening, but because in a world where everyone demanded something of them, here they could simply be. Without performance or pretense, just Taylor and Nick, two people who had loved deeply, lost painfully, and still found the courage to care. She teased him about the salt in his beard, he called her out for still drinking that disgusting vegan Cabernet, and somewhere in the gentle teasing, the soul-searching, and the honesty, there was healing, not dramatic, not explosive, but quiet and profound. When the evening breeze rolled in and the servers began clearing tables, Nick offered to walk her to her car, and Taylor agreed, and as they strolled side by side under the twinkling patio lights, he suddenly said, "You know, maybe we were too good at pretending we didn't need each other back then," and Taylor, pausing beside the passenger door of her car, turned to him and said, "Maybe we needed the years apart to appreciate what we had," and for a long moment, neither spoke, they just looked at each other, not with the passion of lovers but the comfort of old friends who had weathered the same storm, and maybe, just maybe, were ready to stand under the same umbrella again. Nick reached out, tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, and whispered, "No more pretending, okay?" As she drove away that evening with a peculiar lightness in her heart, Taylor acknowledged that perhaps the most surprising link was the one formed not on fairy tales but on the broken pieces they dared to reveal. She nodded, smiling despite the pain in her chest, and responded, "No more pretending."